Daryl Hall and John Oats were one of the most successful music groups for many years. They worked together for years, had hit after hit, and formed a bond that seemed nearly difficult to break. Things were bad between them behind the music, though, and no one knew about it until it was too late. Then, in 2023, something made everything different. The words Hall used to describe what happened were stronger than anyone thought they would be. The two guys were together for more than 50 years before they were suddenly on opposite sides of a court case. What did they really do to each other? And why did Hall care so much about it? Discover the story behind Daryl Hall and John Oates' nasty breakup with us. The link between them was already broken. What's strange about the Hall and Oates breakup is that the partnership didn't just end when the lawsuit got public. Before that, Daryl Hall and John Oates had not been working together creatively for many years. Fans still thought they were the same popular pair. They could go on stage together, play songs that everyone knew, and keep selling out shows. But the relationship had changed a lot behind that public face. They met for the first time in 1967, while they were both students at Philadelphia's Temple University. They each had a different musical background, but they quickly found that their sounds and ideas got along well. It was Hall's strong voice that became one of the sounds that made their biggest hits unique. Oates added guitar, singing, songwriting, and a different musical point of view to the group. When they first met, their differences helped them, not hurt them. As their careers grew, Hall became the more well-known of the two. A lot of their biggest songs were written with his help, and he sang lead on many of them. Even though Oates was also a great musician and songwriter, Hall got more attention from the people. Many fans thought of them as two parts of the same act because their names became so linked. People thought that way for decades. From the outside, Hall and Oates looked like a close musical team that had made it through all the changes in the music business. They had huge hits, went on tours together, and kept performing the songs that made them popular. But things were changing quickly inside the partnership. Later, Hall said that the two hadn't really worked together creatively in decades. Hall says that the last song he wrote with Oates was in the year 2000. This is an important point because it shows how different their partnership in public was from how they worked together on projects. They could still play music together, but they weren't making new music together as often as they used to. So why did they keep going? It was easy to figure out part of the answer. Still, Hall and Oates did well as a touring band. People wanted to hear the well-known songs, and they could still make money by playing them. Individuals didn't think that anything important had changed as long as both guys kept showing up. They could still sing the songs people loved on stage. People in the crowd could still hear "I Can't Go For That," "Kiss on My List," "Private Eyes," and "Rich Girl." It might have looked like nothing had changed to someone in the crowd. But singing old songs together was not the same as working together to make new music. Over time, Hall worked on more and more projects and built a name for himself outside of the team. The same thing Oates did. It became more important for them to focus on their own jobs, and their interests changed. In addition, Oates became more open about the fact that he was a solo artist and not just one half of a constant musical unit. That change was important. Hall seemed to see Hall and Oates mostly through the creative things they had made together. More and more, Oates stressed that they were two different artists who had worked well together. For years, those two points of view could coexist, but in the end, they caused a big problem. The main problem was that neither man seemed to have fully talked about how their standards had changed. They could keep traveling. They could keep playing their hits. They could keep showing up together if the business needed them to. They were still friends and worked together, but not as much as they did when they were young musicians in Philadelphia. As of the time the lawsuit became known, it wasn't the first thing that caused the break. It was the moment when a problem that had been hidden for years could no longer be hidden. And the choice that made all of that stress public was going to make their relationship, which had been going on for decades, even busier. The unfair partnership. Hall and Oates were asked the same question everywhere they went for decades. Who really did what made the duo so successful? There's no easy answer. Daryl Hall was the member who stood out the most, but John Oates was always more than just the man next to him. Hall was a huge part of the group's success. People all over the world knew his voice in pop music, and he sang lead on many of the duo's biggest hits. Besides playing guitar, he wrote a lot of songs and was often the person who got the most attention from fans and reporters. Most of the time, Hall's name and picture came first when people talked about Hall and Oates. One of the most important parts of their relationship was how different they were in the eyes of the public. The face that most people knew was Hall's. They knew right away that it was the singer's voice. He was in a lot of interviews and promotional materials, and the public's view of the band became closely linked to his personality. People often thought of Hall as the main star, even though the group's name was Hall and Oates. That doesn't mean Oates was just a backup player, though. Oates sang, played guitar, wrote songs, and gave the pair ideas that helped make their sound. He helped write a lot of important songs for Hall and Oates, including some big hits that were important to their career. Besides playing guitar behind Hall's vocals, he did other things, as well. He wrote songs with them, helped them record, and helped shape the music they made together. That makes the difference between how people see them even more interesting. Oats might be very important to the relationship, but not get as much attention as other people in the group. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Someone can make a big difference in the success of an action without becoming the person most linked to that action. It would be unfair to think that this made Oats automatically angry. We don't have enough information to say for sure how he felt about the partnership at every point in their work, but what he said later gives us a good idea. Oates said over and over that he and Hall were two separate artists who worked together. He did not always think that the fact that they worked together meant that they had to stay linked as people or artists. As they got older, that difference became more and more important. Even in the beginning of their work, this idea was clear. Their records were credited to Daryl Hall and John Oats, instead of being shown as the work of a single person or a band with a clear name. From the start, there were two names, two musicians, and two separate people. The trouble was that these differences can be harder to keep up when you're successful. For Hall, the partnership could be seen as a joint artistic project that had led to decades of music. A big part of Hall's life had been building that image and performing those songs with Oates. Oates talked about the friendship from a different point of view over time. He talked a lot about his freedom and who he was as a musician. He wanted to move forward for his own separate reasons, with his own projects and things that interested him. Neither point of view was always unreasonable. They were hard because they could make people have very different ideas about what should happen when someone wanted to move on. Think about two people who have worked together for decades, but no longer agree on what it means to be partners. Some people might think that the relationship itself should be protected because of all the good things they've done together. The other person might think that the work was always the result of two separate individuals who should be able to pursue their own goals in the future. That disagreement can be dealt with for years if both sides don't bring it up directly. But when people don't talk about a disagreement for decades, even small ones can get much worse. For one person, a choice may seem like just another business matter, but for another, it may be very personal. A request for independence could be seen as a refusal, and an argument about money or who owns something can quickly turn into a trust issue. It looks like that's what happened with Hall and Oates. They were no longer just arguing about who wrote which song or who got more attention as their partnership came to an end. The real question was whether or not these two men still agreed on what Hall and Oates was. And if both men had wanted more freedom for years, why did their breakup cause such a big fight? That answer starts with the years when Hall and Oates kept working together, even though their creative relationship had changed a lot, the peaceful space between. There wasn't a big fight or a public announcement that showed something had changed between Daryl Hall and John Oats. It was that they could keep working together even though they weren't really working together on projects anymore. The way Hall and Oates made a living for years was by making songs together. They made records, wrote songs, and found a sound that made them one of the most popular pop music duos in the United States. But that process changed over the years. Their personal relationship grew farther apart, and their artistic link got much weaker. Still, the business partnership went on. They went on tour anyway. They still played their most famous songs. They still went on stage together in front of people who were expecting to see Hall and Oates. From the outside, it didn't look like the relationship had gotten so difficult. Hall later gave a very different account of what happened. He said that he and Oates hadn't really worked together on anything creative in decades. The important thing is that they could still play together even though they weren't making new music together all the time. That made things very strange. The two men could still perform songs they had written together many years ago on the same stage, but their friendship that had led to those songs was not working the same way it had before. The crowd, on the other hand, had a hard time telling the difference. At a show, two musicians don't have to be close like they were when they were writing a song. People could still hear the music the way they remembered it if Hall sang lead vocals and Oates played guitar. People knew the songs, the shows went on, and the Hall and Oates name was still valuable in the business world. That made it possible for the partnership to last long after the creative relationship had ended. Both men were building their lives and businesses outside of the duo at the same time. Hall did work on his own and also worked on TV shows and other music projects. People could see him work with other musicians and explore music outside of the Hall and Oates partnership on his show, Live from Daryl's House. Oates also tried to make solo albums and act alone. He showed himself more and more as a unique artist with his own musical goals and hobbies. Being John Oates from Hall and Oates wasn't the only thing that made him who he was. His solo work also helped. It made sense to have these different jobs. Both men had worked together for decades. But now they were both at a stage in their lives where their own projects could take center stage. The trouble was that their joint business didn't go away when their individual careers did. Still, Hall and Oates was a good name. The two men had songs to play, businesses to run, and financial ties that bound them together. Through the business side of their old relationship, they could become more independent as artists while still being linked. That's where things got really tricky in the relationship. In the end, Hall said that the partnership had become limiting. Based on what he said, it sounds like staying together as Hall and Oates might make it harder for both guys to move forward on their own. It looked like Hall didn't think that ending the creative partnership meant that they had to end their business relationship as well. Oates took a different approach to the problem. In later comments, he stressed his need to be independent and move forward with his own career and interests. It may not seem like a big deal, but after decades of being together, it meant a lot. The partnership was something that Hall and his partner had worked together to build, but they still had to respect each other when big choices were made. When Oates looked at the same arrangement, he saw two different at the same artists who had worked well together but had to split up because they had different interests. Neither point of view automatically explains what came next. The important thing is that the two men didn't seem to need the same thing from Hall and Oates anymore. What really hurt was how that breakup happened. It was one thing to want to be independent. Figuring out how to split up the shared business ownership and the leftover shares was a whole different story. Once those questions were taken seriously, tensions that hadn't been solved in decades became important. Later, Hall said that it seemed like Oates had just chosen one day that he didn't want to keep going. Not only did Hall think it was bad that the partnership was ending, but he also thought it was bad how the choice was made. This difference would soon become the most important part of the whole dispute. Because if two people finally decide they don't want to be together anymore, it doesn't have to turn into a war. But for Hall and Oates, the fight over how to split up was much worse than the choice to split up itself. Then, in November 2023, that private fight turned into a very public court case, the worst kind of deception. It was no longer possible for Daryl Hall and John Oats to handle their problems behind closed doors by November 2023. A choice about a business they both owned made decades of bad feelings public and changed their relationship for good. Hall Oates Enterprises was the company at the center of the fight. They had built up cash and business ties over the years as Hall and Oates, which were linked to the business. That meant it was a big deal who owned the company. The other man's position and the future of the partnership could be affected by any big change in one man's interest. In 2023, Oates started to sell his part of the business to Primary Wave Music, a big music rights company. The deal was an important part of Oates' plan to move forward on her own. But Hall had a very different view of what was going on. The main issue wasn't just that Oates wanted to sell his share, according to Hall's court papers. It was because Hall said he wasn't properly consulted before the deal was made. That difference is very important. Because they had worked together for more than 50 years, Hall thought that they would talk about a big business choice. His statement was that he learned about the proposed deal in other ways. According to the story given, Hall was shocked that there had been no private phone call, talk, or warning before the deal was made. That turned what Hall thought was a business choice into something much more personal. He said that because of the deals they already had, Oates couldn't sell his share to someone else without his permission. In other words, Hall didn't think Oates could just decide on his own. Because of this, Hall went to court in November 2023 to try to stop the deal. His lawyers said that Oates' actions broke long-standing agreements they had made. In his court papers, Hall said that the planned sale was a major breach of the partnership agreement. Hall said that what happened was the worst kind of betrayal of a relationship. That word choice showed how personal the argument had become. If the disagreement had only been about how much a business interest was worth, it might have been a normal business dispute. There are always disagreements about money, contracts, and who owns what. But Hall's response showed that he thought something much worse had happened. For him, it was about trust. Hall and Oates had been friends since they were young guys at Temple University. They had made songs, played shows, and built a business around their music for more than 50 years. In spite of the differences that had grown between them, Hall still seemed to think that past was important when making a big choice. So, the thought that Oates might be able to go ahead with a deal that involved things they both liked without first talking to him was very upsetting. This is the easiest way to understand Hall's point of view. He thought he deserved one phone call after 50 years. Even though that assumption seems simple, it became the emotional center of the fight. The problem got even worse when a Tennessee court stopped the planned deal for a while the legal dispute went on. That meant that the two musicians could no longer settle their argument alone. Lawyers and court papers were now being used to discuss it. Fans had brushed off signs for years that Hall and Oates' relationship had changed. They could still go on tour. They could still sing their well-known songs. They could still go public together if they had to. But a case was not the same. They could no longer keep their private disagreements between themselves secret after the court papers were filed. Their different thoughts on the partnership were now known to everyone. Hall's version made me cry a lot. He thought Oates had made a big choice that would affect something they had worked on together without even talking to him first. He thought that what they did showed that they could no longer trust each other. While Hall said that the case was, as Hall said it was, Oates did not agree. His point of view was very different. Oates insisted that he had the right to take care of his own business and saw his move toward independence as a way to separate their work lives. From his point of view, the fact that they had worked together for decades did not mean that they had to stay together forever. That difference is very important because it shows that saying only Daryl Hall was lied to by John Oats does not cover the whole story. someone and someone else were connected, but they had very different ideas about the relationship. Hall looked back at decades of work that had been done together and thought that past made it necessary to talk. As time went on, Oates saw two different artists who had worked well together, but had reached a point where their interests needed to diverge. It's not possible to take either side's interpretation as the only truth. The legal conflict showed that their trust in each other had dropped to a level where they could no longer handle big disagreements behind closed doors. It was now necessary to have contracts, lawyers, and court orders. That's what made November 2023 so important. The sale idea did not cause all of Hall & Oates' problems at once. These issues had been getting worse for a long time. The fight, on the other hand, brought up old grudges and gave both men a chance to say in public what they thought their relationship had been like. At the time, the event seemed to prove for Hall something he had been thinking about for years. Oates no longer saw their relationship the way Hall did. The situation meant something different to Oates. He needed to become independent and separate his personal and professional goals from a company that had shaped much of his work life. Now comes the most important question. How did two artists who had been together for more than 50 years get to the point where they needed lawyers to talk to each other? The answer goes back a long time, a lot longer than November 2023. Hall was finally letting his guard down when he talked about it. What Daryl Hall said in the end. When the lawsuit got out, Daryl Hall talked about his relationship with John Oats in a more public way. That was important because Hall and Oates had carefully fed the public image of a successful musical duo for most of their work. In private, they might have had disagreements, but to the public, they were two musicians who had worked together for decades. After the fight, that was different. Hall was no longer just talking about old songs, tours that went well, or the history of the pair. He was talking about how their relationship had changed and how long the problems had been going on for. He and Oates hadn't really worked together creatively in decades, which was one of the most important things that was said. It was stated that the two had kept working and touring together, even though they didn't write songs together as much as they used to. In this new light, the case makes sense. It wasn't at that moment that Hall decided he didn't want anything to do with Oates. Their artistic partnership had changed many years before. Hall kept playing with Oates because Hall & Oates was still a popular act, but he later said that the deal was too restrictive. That word is important. Hall wasn't just saying that he didn't like traveling with Oates. According to what he said, continuing to do business under the Hall & Oates name had become too restrictive for both of them. Even though each man had his own hobbies, projects, and sense of self, they stayed linked through their partnership. So the case seems to have been about more than just losing Oates as a creative partner. Hall already knew that their working relationship wasn't the same as it used to be. The way Oates tried to keep their business interests separate seems to have hurt him. His public language makes it more clear that he feels betrayed, angry, and frustrated. That difference is very important. Hall's response makes more sense when you look at how they've been together in the past. He had been professionally linked to Oates for more than 50 years. They began as young musicians, built a successful career together, and went by the name Hall & Oates for many years. Even though their artistic relationship had changed, Hall still seemed to think that they had some basic duties to each other. That belief was put to the test by the proposed business deal. Hall's problem wasn't just that Oates wanted to be free, and it was that a big business choice had been made without the direct talk Hall was used to having with someone he had known and worked with for most of his adult life. That makes sense of why his response looked so strong. It wasn't just a deal from Hall's point of view. It seemed to say something about their relationship in the choice. How could Oates make such a big choice without first talking to him? What did that mean for the relationship they had built over decades? It looks like that question hurt more than the business disagreement itself. Hall had also spent years making a name for himself outside of the pair. He proved that he did not need Hall & Oates to stay fresh through his solo work and TV projects. Without Oates, he could make music, perform, and work with other artists. It would be too easy to say that Hall was mad because he couldn't go on without John Oats. It's clear he could. The more complicated idea is that Hall was mad because the fight made him face what he thought Oates thought about their relationship. They couldn't talk about the bigger problems for years. They could do their hits on tour and work on their own projects at the same time. Their disagreements were mostly kept between them. That changed because of the suit. All of a sudden, Hall had to explain his situation to everyone. Because of what someone he had known since 1967 did, he had to go back decades in time and explain why it hurt him so much. During that process, old anger may have come to the surface again. When a relationship ends after years of problems that haven't been fixed, the last fight can make people remember everything that happened before. From what Hall said about how they weren't creative together, how traveling limited them, and how trust broke down, it sounds like the problems were not new. The lawsuit was just the thing that made it impossible to avoid them. And that's the most important difference. Hall didn't get angry all of a sudden because he and Oates stopped working together on projects. That had happened years before, according to Hall. It looks like his anger had more to do with how the final separation was handled and what he thought that decision showed about the relationship. The event was the lawsuit. It had been building up for years, and John Oates had his own idea of why the partnership had finally hit this point. Hall and Oates may have made some of their best music together, but their relationship ended in a way that neither of them probably saw coming. The fight between Daryl Hall and John Oates shows how difficult it can be to be together after more than 50 years. Thanks for watching. If you like this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about the real lives and secret conflicts of famous musicians.